Hi everyone, and welcome to this video all about Indian classical music. Hopefully by the end of this video you should have some sort of idea of whereabouts Indian classical music comes from, the type of instruments that are used to create a piece of Indian classical music, and how this style of music is actually pieced together. First thing we need to know is whereabouts in the world Indian classical music comes from. Now the clue is in the title. It obviously comes from India, but whereabouts is that? Well, we're over here in the UK and India is to the east of us, all the way over there. So that's where Indian classical music comes from. Now I'm going to play you a piece of Indian classical music. There we go. And I want you to think about the following. How is this music different to other types of classical music that you've listened to so far? And how can you tell this is Indian classical music just by listening to it? So if you know absolutely nothing about Indian classical music, how can you tell that this is Indian music even if you're listening to it for the very first time? Have a little listen and see what you think. Okay, so that's just a short sample of a piece of Indian classical music. So, what did we think? How is that different to other types of classical music that we've listened to? And how can we tell that that's Indian music, even if that's the very first time we've listened to a piece of Indian music? What would make us think that that's an Indian piece of music? Hopefully you should have noticed that the instruments sound completely different to the other types of classical music that we've listened to. So far, all the types of classical music that we have listened to has been from Western culture using Western instruments. Indian classical music obviously uses Indian instruments, and it's those instruments that give it that Indian feel and that Indian sound. So let's have a little look at some of the instruments that are used in Indian classical music. First instrument we're going to listen to is the tabla drums. Now these are a pair of hand drums and they come in two different sizes. We don't have to choose between them. A tabla player would use both the drums at the same time, and the reason there's two different size drums is they give a high and a low pitch. This is the smaller drum here, which gives a higher pitch sound, and this is the low pitch drum here, which gives obviously a low pitch sound. Now these drums are used to play the tala. A tala is a repeating rhythmic pattern, and there are many different talas that an Indian classical musician would have to learn. I suppose you could always call this a drum beat, but in Indian classical music there's no such thing as a drum beat. It is called the tala. So let's have a little listen to see what they sound like. So that's the tabla drums, and they play the tala. Next instrument we're going to have a look at is the sitar. Now the sitar looks a little bit like a guitar, but it is a lot bigger than a guitar with a lot more strings. A sitar can have up to 20 strings on it, whereas a guitar would normally only have six strings on there. Okay, the sitar plays the main melody. But in Indian classical music, we don't call that the melody, we call that the raga. It's really important you remember these words, okay? So the sitar plays the raga. Let's have a little listen to see what that sounds like. And that is the sitar, which plays the raga. The next instrument we're going to have a look at is the tambura. There it is, took a while to load. Now the tambura does look very, very similar to the sitar, but a tambura has less strings than a sitar, usually only 4 strings, and it's quite a lot smaller in size as well. Now the tambura plays the drone. Now a drone is put together using either a single note or lots of notes. It could have 1 note, it could have 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, as many notes as that piece of music requires. Now the important thing to remember is the drone uses really long held notes, usually lower in pitch than the sitar. Now the reason why it's called a drone is because these notes are so long and held. The notes almost sort of drone on into each other, which hence the name drone. Let's have a little listen to a tambura playing a drone. So there we go, that drone there only used 2 notes, and it was going backwards and forwards between those 2 notes, but you should have heard that the notes were quite long and held, and they sort of drone on into each other, which again, hence the name, the drone. So, those are the 3 main instruments used in Indian classical music. There are other instruments, but those are the 3 main important ones. And they are used to make up the 3 main components of Indian classical music. So there's the tala, which is the rhythmic pattern. We could call it a drum beat, but we don't want to fall into that trap. Try not to call it a drum beat. It is known as the tala. There's the raga, which is the main melody. Again, refrain from calling it a melody. It is known as the raga. And the drone, which are continuous notes in the background. And again, it could be as simple as 1 long held note, or it could be many notes. But the important thing is that you remember that they are long held notes, hence the name drone. Now I'm going to show you a video of 3 Indian classical musicians performing a piece of classical music. I want you to try and identify these 3 different parts. See if you can see the instruments that they're playing them on, and see if you can pick out the 3 individual sections. There's 3 individual parts. The video that I'm going to show you features an Indian classical musician by the name of Ravi Shankar, who's perhaps one of the most famous Indian classical musicians there is. So here we go. Let's have a little look at this video and see if we can't identify those 3 parts. So we're looking for the, let's just go back. We're looking for the tala, the raga, and the drone. Let's have a little look. Ravi Shankar is the musician who's sat in the middle there, and he's holding the sitar. So that's Ravi Shankar, and he's playing the sitar, which of course is the raga. He's playing the raga on the instrument known as the sitar. And this person here, she's playing the drone on the instrument called the tambura. And the person over to the left, as you can probably see, has got a pair of hand drums in front of him, which are the tabla. So we've got the tabla player here, who's playing the tala. We've got the tambura player here, who's playing the drone. And we've got the sitar player here, who's playing the raga. And there we go. So, let's have a little look at the structure of Indian classical music. Let's have a little look at how it's actually pieced together. Now, a typical performance of Indian classical music will follow this basic structure. So it'll have an opening section. This is usually just the raga, which is performed by the sitar. Now, large parts of this section of the performance will be improvised. And if you can't remember what improvise means, it means that it's largely made up there and then. It won't just be anything that the sitar player wants to throw together. It will be a set of pre-arranged notes which make up that raga, but he might change the order that they're played, he might change the way that they're played, he might change the speed in which he plays it. There's no set rule. It's largely made up and largely improvised. The tabla player is usually silenced during this section, so there's no regular beat or rhythmic pattern, and the tempo of the raga is generally quite slow to start off with. The sitar is usually accompanied by the drone. The drone might start a little bit after the sitar, it might start at the same time, and that is obviously performed on the tambura. Let's have a little listen to what an opening section might sound like. So we've got the drone in the background there, and the sitar has just joined in, and he has just started playing the raga. As you can hear, it's quite slow in tempo. So that's just a short sample of what an opening section might sound like. Moving on after that, we go to the middle section of the song. Now the tempo in the middle section will gradually increase, giving a greater sense of meter. And if you can't remember what meter means the beat in the bar. Now Indian classical music, the beats will be measured in a different way, but it should give us a sense of being able to count along with those beats. The improvisations become more elaborate, so they become a lot more complicated, and there's greater use of ornamentation around the raga. So what do we mean by ornamentation? We mean there might be notes that are added in there, there might be some fancy techniques like little trills between 2 or 3 notes, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the improvisations becoming more elaborate and more complicated. Now the tabla player does not really feature during this section. They might start to play a simple rhythmic pattern, but not always, and if they do join in, they generally take a little bit of a back seat and let the sitar player take the front seat, and they're kind of leading this section of the song. So let's have a little listen to what a middle section might sound like. So we can start to count the beats a little bit there. So if I try and count along, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... We couldn't do that in the first section. As you can hear, things are starting to get a little bit more complicated, and we've got the tabla drums being played in the background. So that's just a sample of what a middle section might sound like. Moving on, we go to the final and last section of the music. Now, by this point, the tabla player has joined in by playing the tala, and which gives the whole performance more of a rhythmic structure. Towards the end of the music, the tempo increases even more, and there are more complex rhythmic and melodic ideas going on. The whole thing becomes a lot more busy, and there's a lot more going on within the music. The sitar and tabla player normally interact with each other using question and answer phrasing, which means the tabla player might play something and the sitar player would then play something to answer that. So if the tabla player was to play a really fast phrase, the sitar player might then answer that by playing an equally fast phrase. Okay, so they kind of bounce ideas between the two of them. So let's have a little listen to what a final section might sound like. Hopefully you'll hear that there's a lot more going on, that the tabla player is becoming a lot more involved, and it has sped up slightly. Let's have a little listen. So again, that's just a sample of what a final section might sound like, and hopefully you identified that it's faster than the other two sections we've listened to, and there's more going on. And the final thing that we need to talk about are performers of Indian classical music. And the two most famous performers of Indian classical music are Ravi Shankar, who is a sitar player, and we saw him play on the video earlier on, and Ala Rakar, who is a tabla player. And like I said, these are possibly the two most famous performers of Indian classical music. Okay, that finishes off our video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a little bit about Indian classical music. You can come back as many times as you want and watch this video. If you're unsure about perhaps what a tala is, or what a raga is, or what the sitar sounds like, come back and watch this video, use it for revision, and you're going to be tested on this in class. So good luck.